As you move into higher grades in school, you'll be expected to be responsible for reading a larger amount of material than you were in lower grades. There will be many more things to remember, so it's important to begin to learn skills you will need to be able to handle larger amounts of information for your classes. One skill that will be useful to you is learning to summarize. Learning to write a good summary can help you narrow down a lot of material to what is most important. There's more than one type of summary and more than one way to write a good summary. This video is going to focus on a formula for writing an objective summary for a narrative. Right now, you might be wondering, what is a narrative? Let's see if the next few video clips will help you remember what a narrative is. Did you remember that a narrative is a story? Remember that a narrative can be fiction, a made-up story, like some of the books shown here, or it can be nonfiction, a true story. A narrative might be long, or it can be short. An objective summary of a narrative is a concise explanation of what that story is about. To be objective, you must not give your opinion about the narrative in your summary. For example, if you've just read a story about an exciting adventure in space that you really liked, when you write your summary, you can't say that it was exciting and you can't say that you liked it, because those are opinions, and in an objective summary, we do not use opinions. To be concise, your summary needs to be brief and to the point. In writing a summary, your goal is to reduce information to only what is necessary for a very basic understanding of the story. One other important thing to remember is that an objective summary of a narrative should be written in the present tense. This is a very basic formula for writing an objective summary for a narrative. It's designed for students who are new to this task. The formula is designed to help you create a one-paragraph summary. To go back to our example of a story about space, if you're going to be concise in your summary, you're not going to describe what the spaceships look like in detail. You won't tell every single event that happened in the story, and you won't describe all of the characters. By now, you're probably wondering, so what do I use in an objective summary for a narrative? It may seem pretty basic to start with this, but the very first thing you have to do before writing an objective summary for a narrative is read the story. Some people find it useful, immediately after finishing a story, to close the book and jot down a few sentences that briefly describe what the story was about. You might want to try this and see if it works for you. This year, you're sometimes going to be asked to write summaries over things that you've read. When you're ready to write a summary that you're going to have to turn in as an assignment to a teacher, there are several specific things that you're going to want to include. For the remainder of this video, we're going to go through step by step a formula for writing an objective summary of a narrative. Please make sure that you have out some paper and a pen or pencil to take some notes. As mentioned earlier, there's more than one good way to write a summary. However, when you begin, sometimes it's easier to use a basic formula or recipe to help you get going. Step 1 is the first sentence. A strong first sentence is important to any kind of writing. The first sentence should include the title of the story, the type of story that it is. For example, is it a mystery, science fiction, an autobiography, or fantasy? The name of the author, and a brief mention of the setting, which is where and when the story takes place. At this point, you might want to stop the video and jot down notes about what should be included in the first sentence. Just a brief reminder, Remember to stop the video anytime you need to take notes. Be sure you write down what each step of the objective narrative summary should include. We're going to use our imaginary story of space travel that was mentioned earlier in the video to provide an example of how you would write an objective narrative summary. Remember that our first sentence is going to include the title, the type of literature, the name of the author, and a brief mention of the setting. So our first sentence for this imaginary story might be something like, Catastrophe in Space is a science fiction short story by Canley Latterman that takes place on a space station at the edge of our solar system in the year 2118. Here's the sentence written out on this slide. Notice how the title, Catastrophe in Space, is in italics. That's that slanted writing. When you type a book title, it should be in italics. If you write a book title out by hand, you punctuate it by underlining. This sentence contains all the parts that our formula specifies for the first sentence: the title, the type of literature, the author's name, and a brief mention of the setting. Step 2 is the second sentence. In the second sentence, you're going to introduce the main character or characters and briefly tell what their situation is at the beginning of the story. The emphasis here is on the word briefly. You should try really hard to make this just one sentence, but sometimes if there are a number of main characters, you might have to write more than one sentence for step 2. We're going to continue our example summary using the space story. As part of their college training, teen engineering students from Earth, Anya Lyle and Gorlan Amato, are completing a one-year internship on Space Station 103. For the second sentence of our example summary, we have introduced the main characters, in this case there are 2, and briefly explained their situation at the beginning of the story. Step 3, the third sentence of our formula, should explain the beginning of the main conflict, the most serious problem that the main character or characters must face. As we continue our example using the space story, our third sentence might be something like this. When Gorlan and Anya have only been in their internship for 2 months, the crew faces an unexpected attack by hostile aliens called Draconis, who are using a high-pitched sound wave designed to kill everyone aboard the space station. Let's take a look at this sentence on the slide. Remember that this sentence should explain the beginning of the most serious problem that the main characters are going to have to face. Notice that we've included that the main characters have only been in their internship for 2 months. This is an important part of the serious problem that they're facing because they are not experienced, and that might affect how they meet the serious problem that they're going to have to face. In step 4, the fourth sentence, you're going to summarize the action at the climax of the story. Remember that the climax is the high point or the most exciting part of the story. The climax is when the main characters have their final struggle with their most serious problem, the one that you described in sentence 3. As our space adventure example continues, we'll move on to the fourth sentence. The Draconis are winning, the regular engineering crew have all been injured, and Anya and Gorlan realize everyone will soon be killed unless they can figure out a way to overcome the enemy. This slide shows the sentence that explains the climax of this story. It gives just enough information that someone who hasn't read the story can understand what's going on, but it doesn't give a lot of detail. Step 5, the fifth sentence. In step 5, you'll write one sentence that tells how the main character or characters overcome the problem happening in the climax. In narratives, the main characters are frequently the heroes, and they usually overcome the major problem that they face in the story. However, sometimes someone or some situation helps the main character overcome the big problem in the climax. And if that's the case in the story that you end up writing about, you need to include that information in step 5, sentence 5 of your summary. So sentence 5 of our imaginary summary based on our space adventure might be something like, at the last moment, Gorlin and Anya come up with a way to deflect the deadly sound wave back at the alien ship, saving the space station. Step 6 is the final sentence. In step 6, you're going to write one sentence that tells what happens at the end of the story. So creating a last sentence for our imaginary space story, it might be something like, at the end of the story, Admiral Janaea presents Anya and Gorlin with medals for bravery, and they're preparing to travel back to Earth to continue their education. This is how the last sentence would look when we type it out. This would be the final sentence of our summary for our imaginary narrative that takes place in space. Step 6 is the last step of our very basic formula to use for creating an objective summary for a narrative. If you were doing this as an exercise for a teacher on a future assignment, you would still need to go back and proofread your work, correct mistakes, and rewrite or retype your assignment neatly before you turned it in. To review, step 1 is to write a sentence that tells the title, type of literature, author's name, and a brief description of the setting. Step 2 introduces the main character or characters and briefly tells what their situation is at the beginning of the story. Step 3 explains the beginning of the main conflict that the main character or characters must face. Step 4 summarizes the action at the climax, the high point of the story. In step 5, you'll tell how the main character or characters overcome the problem happening in the climax. In step 6, the final step, you'll write one sentence that tells what happens at the end of the story. This concludes this video lesson. You can expect that sometime in the near future, your teachers will ask you to write an objective narrative summary for something that you read.